Leda Glyptis, welcome to Leaders and Founders.
Thank you for having me. It's good
Thank
to
you
be
for
here.
joining us. So I guess for anybody who's listening or watching who doesn't know who you are, do you want to give us a bit of a intro and run through with you and your background?
Sure. I suppose I have been describing myself as a banker in recovery for quite a long time now. I'm an accidental banker, but I did pretty traditional banking for a long time, mostly in transformation and sort of technology deployment work. The last few years I've worked on the fintech side of the equation, mostly core banking. And about a year and a half ago, I went rogue, as one of my friends put it, and I have been working as an external advisor to some pretty large organizations, some smaller ones, essentially doing the same work I've been doing for the last 20 years, just from a different vantage point.
Awesome. And you say accidental banker. Why so, or how so?
Oh, in every possible way. If you had asked me when I was 18, 19, I would have told you I'd rather die than become something that, to me, from the outside in particular, seemed so predictable and, I don't know, very establishment, very. I was a political scientist by background. I had no desire to have that traditional form of success. But when I left university, it was a very interesting time because I don't think that would happen anymore. But we're talking pre-financial crisis because I'm old. And it was almost impossible to graduate from a sort of good university and not be pulled into the orbit. I tried so hard not to do this.
Not hard enough, clearly.
Evidently not hard enough. And I actually got a couple of jobs in sort of, I worked for a think tank for a time. It was just so boring. I worked in a private security company with Gates, Guns and Gurkhas, as they described themselves. But of course, your job is never what the company does, right? So I worked in the corporate affairs division, and my job was actually pretty dull. And nobody tells you when you finish university that your first couple of jobs will be really boring, which is sadly true. But as I was sort of trying to work out what do you do with an education in political science and a very low threshold for boredom, a bunch of buddies from university were like, we built a system, but we don't like people. And we don't like things.
Who does?
Well, not many software engineers back then. And I was like, I like people, I like things. How hard can this be? What does the system do? And they were like, oh, it's price verification for middle office control functions. And I was like, no idea what any of that means, but okay. And I found myself working on my first implementation. And the rest, as they say, is history. It was a shock to the system to discover I really enjoyed it.
What was it that you enjoyed?
That's a good question. I have never been asked that before. There were a couple of things that I really enjoyed about the work, and then one thing that I enjoyed about the timing, which was entirely accidental. The things I enjoyed about the work is that banking has been done for a very long time in the same way, really. Like the last 150 years have been pretty predictably stable. I know it doesn't feel like that when you're in them, but if you think about it, like largely how we do banking hasn't changed. Even the entities that participate haven't really changed all that much. But a lot of it has grown by osmosis, and there's a whole host of people doing very good work and being very successful who don't necessarily know why the thing works.
It just does.
It just does. And if you carry on doing the thing that your forefathers were doing before you, you'll be fine. But because occasionally things break and nobody knows why, there has always been, even before fintech, a space for people whose job is to troubleshoot when something breaks. And that suits me, that suits my personality. A friend of mine recently said that on my tombstone, it will say, I poked it, it went boing. And I like going around poking things, seeing how they work. So even before fintech and the digital wave came along, there was a place that really suited my personality. And I like solving puzzles, so that worked well. The second thing is that I just lucked out because I fell into banking a couple of years before the financial crisis started, which doesn't sound like a good thing. But
Definitely
it means
an interesting time.
it was definitely an interesting time. You know, people go, we're going through hard times. And it's like, we've only ever gone through hard times and it's been 20 years. But if you think about, I always think of fintech as starting in like 2005, 2006, right? That's when we saw the first API businesses, different business models. And I was sitting in an operations and IT function in a really big bank. And I had a front row seat when the thing started, back in the day when we could fit everyone who did fintech in one room. And frankly, we did. We fit them in one room because back then, Swift InnoTribe got everyone together. So you went to school in a major way, and things that would be their own industry vertical now would be two people in the room, and you talk to them, and you know everything there is to know about, I don't know, robo-advisors, because they're the only ones for now. Now, that didn't last very long, but that was an impossible bit of luck, because you can acquire so much knowledge and so much insight by just being there. As the train leaves the station, you're like, oh, this is nice, I'll stay.
And you almost become like the point of knowledge, looked at with great esteem.
Oh, wow, well, thank you. Yes, by virtue of still being around, I think. So if there's a group of us that are still around, but the vast majority are not, because this is really hard work, because a lot of the founders, I mean, we talk about the fact that there's a high failure rate in startups, right? But we don't talk about founder PTSD and founder burnout. And the reality is most of those folks toughed it out for a few years and not around anymore. And so that knowledge of the early days goes with, I feel like I'm 100 years old when we tell the stories like that. But yeah, I got lucky. I got really lucky because, and I was wrong, as it turns out, right? Because a university student me had a very specific idea of what a career in finance would be. And although I'm sure that very much existed and still does today, it wasn't the only way.
And do you think there was resistance to this change that came through?
Do I think there was resistance? Of course. There was. There was there was passive resistance at first. If I look back, I think the first few years, the resistance was not even intentionally trying to stop something that would change everything. It was more, I'll get to you in my own time. There was as it turns out, really incorrect sense of who's calling the shots around here. But I do remember the early days of bringing these new technology capabilities into banks. And the first reaction from everyone was the regulator will never permit it. And the regulator was like, oh, I don't know, I quite like it. Like, let's talk about what the art of the possible is. And then the attitude was, we'll move in our own time. I remember speaking to a founder recently who I brought into one of the banks I worked in, I don't know, in like 2009. And he just signed a pilot with them recent, like this current calendar year, which I mean to 2024, not the one where we're going to be like a week in when you publish this. But it's just insane. I don't know what's more insane, the fact that it took so long or the fact that he hadn't said enough. I'm calling this a loss. So the idea that we're in control of timings was how resistance happened at first. And the reality is the vast majority of startups have an 18, if you're lucky, 18-month runway. Procurement in a large organization takes about 2 years.
Yeah.
Like that doesn't work out. So at the beginning, resistance was in that space. It was not even conscious. I then think later, the second wave of resistance was, hold up, this is really changing the way we make money. It's challenging what makes me an expert. I don't know where to put it. I don't know what to do with it with the best intentions in the world. This causes more problems than it solves, which started a next wave of resistance. And I think we're now in, 3.0 resistance experience, whereby the market has digitized, the economy has digitized, the regulators have really matured. And the resistance comes from individuals trying to find their own place in a changing economy, which I have a lot of sympathy for. It's hard. So resistance is still there. It keeps morphing and changing. I still occasionally get the, you don't understand, we're different. This doesn't apply to us. Like,
You're not different.
Yeah, you're all exactly the same in just very different ways.
And do you think, like a lot of the neobanks and startups that came through, that push this change quicker than potentially they wanted to go?
I don't actually. I had it's a very good question, and I had this from my students recently, and I think the neobanks came in at a time when they knew that the consumers were ready to consume something like that, and although they accelerated things, it was marginal. I also think that startups got a lot of us inside banks educated. We did a lot of our learnings by doing pilots with willing startups. I think the odds were stacked in our favor at the time because a lot of these pilots were either unpaid or poorly paid. We learned a lot. We didn't necessarily convert those to contracts. So I think they were absolutely pivotal in accelerating the understanding and education of the sector. But I genuinely think that what has driven this is regulators getting it and asking for different things. You know, like most banks created an API strategy because of PSD2. They made good, but most of them were quite happy doing the majority of their payments the old way and doing digital stuff on the edges. So I think quite a lot of the transformation we've seen has been driven by the regulator and by the demands of substantial clients. Because if you're doing global payments processing for a Deliveroo or for an Uber, they will be very demanding, and that's a true story, right? They will be very demanding in terms of margins, clearing and settlement timelines, because they're playing the margin, so they expect you to enable them to realize their business plan. So sadly, the transformation didn't come from the startups. The education did, and I'm pretty sure that the benefit was actually quite one-sided.
Okay, awesome. You've learnt obviously a lot through this journey, which then led you to write a book. Do you want to tell us a bit about what it is?
Yes, well, 2 books actually, as it will be. When are we publishing this? When is it going out?
Early January.
Yeah, 2 books. 2 books. So my first book came out 2 years ago, and somebody described it as a sort of self-help book for bankers, which I think is very, very accurate. And essentially, it's looking back at the last 20 years and says 95% of startups fail, 70% of transformations fail. We know why, but we seem unable to get out of our own way. This is why we can't get out of our own way. And the whole idea is that our technology implementation problems are never technology problems. They're always human problems, and there are ways that we can change without needing to lead a revolution. Because most of the literature we see in this space, you read it and you're like, well, that's great, but unless you have a 20-year culture transformation project rolled out by the CEO, I can't do anything about this. So the whole idea is, what can I as an individual, us as a team, and the whole of the organization, should you get to that, do that is meaningful and sustainable. While I was writing that book, I called my publisher and I was like, I don't want to write this book anymore.
I'm sure that's something they were really glad to hear.
Yeah, well, I can't be the first author who did that. Yeah. So he was very calm about it. And I was like, I don't want to write this because I know the answer. And also because I've been writing my column for coming up to 9 years now. My readers know the answer as well. And he's like, no, it's a bit different. And he was right in long form. Just stick with it. And whatever the other idea is, just write it down somewhere and come back when this is out in the world, which was good advice. But my thinking was, okay, 95% failure rate for startups, 98% in crypto, 70 to 75% failure rate for digital transformations. We're mostly failing. But
there is some hope.
Yes, because we've been doing this for over 20 years now. So even that 5% of startups succeeding and that 30% of digital transformation succeeding over 20 years is enough to see if there is a pattern. So book number 2 was that. But of course, the reason I found it interesting, it goes back to your very early question of what I enjoyed doing in bank. I like solving problems. And what I liked about this one is I didn't know the answer when I started. So you
learned something as well.
I've learned so much. But when you go around doing research, what I hadn't anticipated, because I've done a PhD, right? But most of the people I wrote about were dead. So their opinion didn't really matter in the same way. Whereas this one, I did research, I did a lot of interviews. I did about 60 interviews with people I respect deeply. So when I got down to writing the book, I was like, I hope they like it. Like, I almost don't care if the critics like it, although I do, if you're listening. But you know, you take people's stories and some of them go very, very personal. I hope they feel I've done them justice, you know?
Hopefully you have. I'm sure you have.
I hope I have.
What can we learn from our failed transformations, first of all, I guess? What are people doing wrong that we can do better?
The main, obviously, get the book, but the main thing...
Without giving away the whole book, so people still go by it.
So the main thing that we keep getting wrong is, and there are many things here, right? But if I have to pick one, is that we underestimate how messy the middle gets when you're doing ambitious work. And by the middle, I mean both the middle of the journey and the middle of the effort. One of the most common things that we see out there is that companies commit to a 5-year plan and they have their leading and lagging indicators and it's all going well. And about halfway through, they fire the team and lose heart, bring in McKinsey again to tell them whether they're doing the right thing. They split the work, even though it's going well, because 5 years sounds sensible, but 2 years in the trenches is a really, really long time. And we know that. We know it because it keeps happening. So what are the ways of doing it differently? How can you do a 10-year transformation in 6-month installments? How can you de-risk the process so that you get ahead of the things you know will happen? All of our failures are human. And we do know what they are, but every time we start absolutely convinced that this time will be different. And it's not, because humans are humans. We get tired, we get scared, we get spooked. So we need to stop making ambitious plans and thinking that will be enough and start allowing for the human factor.
Just be a bit more logical.
Yeah, be logical about the fact that we will be emotional.
That's a good point. I like that. It's a
Yeah,
good
someone
quote.
write that down,
That's
right?
a good quote. And from a startup perspective then, for anybody who's either started a business recently or looking to start one, there's a good chance it won't work, but what could they do to increase the chances of success?
Definitely get my second book, definitely.
Obviously.
So there are a few things. One of the things that I keep saying in my book, because it came out again and again in the research, is that there will be quite a few things that are outside your control. And by virtue of them being outside your control, you cannot control them, but you need to be mindful of them when they hit. And a lot of people, we have a culture, particularly in our industry, of like messianic founders against the odds. And the reality is, if your market is giving you feedback, take it. And sometimes that feedback might be pivot because there's an opportunity created by the conditions around you. And sometimes it will be the thing you're trying to do isn't working. It might not be working right now and it will work in 2 years' time, but if you don't manage your 2 years and your runway and your exposure, you won't get there, right? So one of the things is a lot of it will be outside your control, but you can still control how you react to what happens. The second thing is you need to do a lot of hard things at the same time. I see a lot of companies, particularly when investment money was easier to come by than it is now, that we're leaving a lot of stuff for later. Product market fit. We don't need to get the pricing right. No, you do. Governance, we'll get to it. No, you won't, because you'll have like skeletons under the stairs when you do. Culture, we'll get to it when we're bigger. There are things that feel like nice to haves, particularly if you have someone giving you money to grow fast at all cost. But the reality is, unless you get the bone structure of your business right, it's very hard to fix.
So is that planning more so when you start, or having a longer vision than a lot of startups do?
It's a little bit of both. And that's where it helps if it's your second rodeo, right? So the vast majority of startup founders have no idea what the product needs to cost for their target product market fit and target addressable market as presented in their investor deck to be true. It's one of the things that they usually test and learn using investor cash. But the reality is your cost and your operating costs need to be married to each other. The vast majority of startups, particularly when capital was like, wee, free, they didn't know that, and they didn't need to know that, and they heard enough success stories that grew at all costs, and then the rest caught up. But the reality is, if you want to run a sustainable business, you need to make more money than you spend. For that to happen, you need to have an understanding of what your cost to serve is, what your cost to get there is, what your cost of customer acquisition is, and what your profit margin is, and when does it wash its face. It's very hard to know that if it's your first rodeo. It's actually sometimes hard to know that even if it's your second rodeo. But that's where a sustainable business that isn't fed by investors lives and dies, right? And these are not conversations that we've historically had with founders. And it's not conversations that we expected founders to have with their teams. But we're entering an era where capital isn't as free-flowing. And you hear that even angel investors will now not invest in pre-revenue startups. And you're like, oh, that's interesting.
Bursting.
Yeah, the world is changing.
But like you said, you've only heard of the success stories of these companies that didn't have to worry about costs and just spending freely. You hear the successes of them, but you potentially don't hear all the stories where that doesn't work.
You're right, but we do have success stories that actually had a eagle, hawkeye over their, all of the birds of prey, over their cost to serve. But because of how we think about it, we don't necessarily celebrate them for that. So Wise is a company, and one of the ones that featured in my book, that were so focused on their cost to serve because they knew that theirs was always going to be a margin business, and they needed to be competitive on price, and therefore their margin had to be defensible, and therefore their cost to serve was the most important thing to look at. They're the only ones I have come across who did that right first time round. I met a lot of founders who got it right after not getting it right, if you see what I mean.
Learn the hard way.
Yeah, you learn the hard way.
That actually brings on quite nicely. You wrote for your Leda Writes articles a few weeks back, Overheard on the Tube. And it was all about...
I can't tell you how many poisonous DMs I got on the back
I did
of
see
that
some
one.
of the comments on LinkedIn of people just saying you hated flexible working and hybrid working. But the premise of it was...
Completely
I don't know if
not
you want to run
that,
through
yeah.
what the actual article
Yes,
was,
please.
so I don't butcher it.
I do. So before I say what the piece was about, let me say that one of the things that has happened as the column has become more popular is that it's obvious that a lot of people comment without reading it. A lot of people comment
That's
without
just
reading
humans,
it.
that's what we do.
And sometimes they're very friendly comments, but it's obvious they haven't read, particularly because if you read me, you know that I always use slightly off-the-wall titles. The title never describes what you're getting.
Every time.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah. So you get some very like saccharine, sweet, but like entirely pointless messages. They're like, did a bot write it? Did you write? Thank you anyway. And then you get some really venomous ones. I wrote one a few years back called The Elephant in the Room. And it was about someone wearing an elephant suit, and I can get back to that story if you want me to. But I had someone who left these awful messages and sent me some DMs, because my DMs are not locked, about how it's a like deeply imperialistic thing to talk about elephants like that. And I was like, what? So anyway, back to Overheard on the Tube. So this was written on the back of a conversation I genuinely heard while riding the tube. And it was a bunch of very young adults. I mean, everyone looks young to me at this point in my life, but I think 21, 22, first job territory. And they were having a very thoughtful conversation about the fact that one of them in particular was feeling really demoralized by the fact that learning on the job in his particular context involved only learning when he got things wrong.
Which is tough.
Which is extremely tough. And the way he was speaking about it really made me feel like we're letting a whole generation down. And my article was about the fact that, first of all, everything I see from the younger generation gives me hope. Everything from the fact that they're much more thoughtful about the places where they want to work, about, like, I've had more young white heterosexual men ask me about the diversity statistics of the teams that they're about to join than people who would be included in those statistics. And that matters, right? My generation wouldn't have done that. It does, exactly. So I feel that, the kids are all right and we're not necessarily setting them up right. So my piece was about the fact that he wasn't angry. And that was the thing that really stayed with me. He was saying, I know for next time. That was his punchline. It wasn't even, I know for next time, but it's demoralizing. It was, it's demoralizing, but I know for next time. And that's such a powerful choice. But actually, there is nothing in human endeavor that we can't teach.
Because what's the point of everybody else before?
Exactly.
Going through failures and making mistakes.
And the reality is, for those of us who started work in an office, we learned a lot by osmosis. So a lot wasn't taught properly, but you saw people doing things, and you're like, okay, that's how we do it. We sit up this way, and we say this, and we don't say this. In the absence of that, we, as the generation of those who benefited from 20 years of doing the thing, need to find a way to arm and equip this generation much better. That was my point. How on earth it became somehow read like I'm against hybrid working.
5 days in the office.
5 days in the
7.
office, yeah, and like you shadow someone all day because that's the only way to learn. Please don't take this comment out of context. Whoever it was that was having a go at me.
Yeah, just use that.
They're going to have a field day. I think there is something, certain conversations really rile people up, and a return to the office is definitely one of them. But you seem to be unable to have a sensible conversation. It's either this or that. I don't think we have found the answer, but that doesn't mean we should go back to the office. We just need to find the answer and letting people.
What do you think we could do better?
I think that the start should always be asking the people who need to do the learning what works. We might be surprised by how easy the answer is. I don't know. Part of the challenge we have is that we often default to the hippo making the decision, right? The highest paid person in the room making the decision. But it's not for your benefit. So is it asynchronous communication? Is it more video? Is it shadowing? Is it classes? I doubt it, but it might be. I think asking the people who need the context, what is their way of learning, would help. And then the people who have the context, trying to work out whether you can distill it to 5 bullet points, or it's best if somebody comes to all your calls for a day and sees what your day is made up of and how you react to situation. Is it debriefs? How would you do? I don't know, but I know that we've done pair programming across geographies for years, and it works.
It works pretty well.
It works really well. So why can't we find a way that doesn't need us to return to the office, but doesn't lose us the context? There are certain things that do work better face-to-face, and there are a lot of things that work much better if you do them in the comfort of whatever conditions work best for you. If COVID was how we got to the place where we can have both, then fine, something good came out of it, but we shouldn't lose the ability to pass on the things we've learned, because that's what accelerates human progress. If you have to reinvent the wheel with every new generation, we're going to go backwards. But yeah, somehow I somehow found myself as saying, no, I don't want to go back to the office either. That's not the point.
But I think it's the first time we've ever had something like that where all of a sudden we all have to work remotely.
Yeah.
And it went pretty fine. Everybody managed to get on and still managed to do their job. But I think now we're only having those conversations where potentially struggling to learn because you're only learning from your mistakes. We're only starting to see those big issues a few years later.
And in defense of the people who had a go at me, I will say that we are seeing quite a lot of the larger organizations and more established organizations in finance decreeing a return to the office.
And they thought you were in their corner.
I guess so, because now there is a pretty intense debate unfolding. So I guess a lot of people, without necessarily reading the piece, assumed that it was a piece about that. It was not. It is an interesting one because I see quite a lot of commentary about people not working very hard from home, which I find staggering because I think people
There's all those studies now about people sleep more when they work from home.
But that,
Is it Jacob Rees-Mogg said something the other day about people who work from home sleep more?
Oh, well, if Jacob Rees-Mogg said it, it must be true. I think it is possible that you sleep more because you don't commute for 3 hours a day. But I find that quite a lot of the teams I've worked with over the years have worked a lot more.
Remotely?
Remotely. because they tend to start work when they would have left home. So all of a sudden, 1 hour, 1.5 hours, your interruptions and your breaks are not what they are if you're in a place with people who might go, oh my God, did you hear what happened to Josh on the way over? And although you might finish on time and be able to have a dinner with your family at a sensible time, your buffer is in there. So I don't have a way of proving it, but I think in our industry, people work more from home. It's different work, though. So I think that any debate where you lose nuance is a dangerous territory. But I do understand why people get defensive, because we're definitely seeing the banks decreeing a higher degree of presence in the office.
Why do you think that is? Do you think it is because they believe you will work better? Or is it the classic, well, they have the offices, they need to pay for them?
I would like to say that it's serendipity and creativity. I'd like to say that because I'm an optimistic sort. I wonder whether it's senior management preferences. As I said, it's usually the hippo gets to make some of these calls, right? So it's senior management preferences. They want to go back to what suits them, maybe. Visibility, like for a very long time, we managed by observation, the same way as we learned by observation. And there's definitely certain aspects of the work that are easier if you can see your teams. Like I can tell you that when we were in an office, I could tell what the energy levels of my team were, who was playing nice with whom, if there were any tensions. You got visual cues that when you were remote, you might not pick up as quickly. But that's no reason to make everyone go back to make my life easier. I think it's a combination of factors. The claim from all the big banks, particularly in America, that are returning to the office is productivity. They claim they have statistics that demonstrate productivity loss. I think it's...
But I always love that with statistics, because you can make statistics say whatever you want. You can find the statistics that you want.
And it depends what questions you ask, right? It's also, I find that all the companies I work with, whether they've gone back to the office or not, has a lot to do with the working preferences of their senior management, whether it's consciously done or subconsciously done.
And then on leadership, I'm sure you've seen great and not so great leadership.
Oh, yes.
Let's talk a bit about that. What for you defines good leadership within an organisation? And how can people be better leaders?
I think, let me start with the second part. How people can be better leaders needs to come from a place of self-awareness, because there are so many leadership manuals out there, but the reality is quite a lot of those behaviors are not available to everyone because of their own personality. So one of the things I can see looking back is that the people who were good leaders had enough self-awareness to know what they're good at, and so build teams that would thrive within those parameters. So I'll give you an example. The way I work, and I became conscious of that as I grew and developed through the ranks, I am the perfect leader for someone who is at a point in their career where they don't need their homework checked. They know I will have their back, and they want the guardrails and the freedom to accelerate. And I will be the best manager and leader that person would ever have. Somebody who needs the constant touch point, the constant assurance, not necessarily the micromanagement, but someone who's maybe earlier on in their career, I'm not the right leader for them. And that is important, because to them, I wouldn't have the amplifying effect that I would have to someone else, or to them in that moment in their career. So I think moving away from there are universal characteristics of a good leader. I mean, there are universal characteristics. And one is your team does something well, the praise goes to them. Your team does something poorly, it's your fault. And that is a universal trait, because you create psychological safety, because you remind yourself of what your responsibilities are. So there are some traits that are universal, but the specifics of how you create a space for people has to be right for them. And it's inevitable that it will have a lot to do with your personality. So finding the right place for you and the right environment for the people that find the way you work suitable is idiosyncratic. I don't believe that there is a way for everything. obviously being a decent human being and protecting your team and giving them the right guidance and having the right support and being available to them. All of that stuff is universal. But beyond that, it's very much down to how do I operate? What are my blind spots? What are my weaknesses? And how will I create a team that benefits from my strengths and isn't hurt by my weaknesses?
And do you think you'd be better off potentially if you did, using the example you gave, somebody who needed that reassurance, saying potentially they're better off in a different team?
Or layered.
Changing your approach to management to them?
Or layered.
Okay.
Right, because like if you have a high growth team that works at a particular pace, having someone who needs a lot of touch points, maybe you don't want them at the coalface. You want them working with someone who has more time. Or the reality when you're working is that you will default to type. And that's one of the things that I've found through my research and through experience of doing this for 20 years. The books are great, but you will default to type. So if you know that your way of working doesn't suit some people, the chances of you saying, I'll manage you differently, and that working out in any length of time are slim. Whereas you can create the right environment for that person by giving them a split reporting line, a layered reporting line, or having them in a place in the organization that suits the way they learn and the way they operate. I've talked about this before. I don't know if we've talked about this before, but I had a guy who worked in my team a few years back. And the first day he joined, he gave me a 14-page Word doc. I was like, what's that? He said, it's your handbook on what I'm like. And at first I was like, okay. And then I started reading it, and it was genius. The guys in product and they're creative, right? It was genius. It showed immense self-awareness about the way he learns, about his needs in terms of emotional support, about the areas where he felt he was strong and not. And now you can't ask everyone to write a 14-page document.
It would be good though, wouldn't it?
But you could have the headlines of this guy's handbook as part of an onboarding conversation. Like, I've taken a lot of lessons from that. So everyone who's worked for me since that day, I've asked them what their communication preferences are. I've discussed mine so that they...
So you're setting that expectation.
Yeah, you sort of bridge a gap. Like, do they prefer frequent, short touch points or long? Like, do you need time to think? I tend to think on my feet a lot. A lot of people need time to think. So there were a lot of things in there, including communication preferences and when you react best to feedback. That has given me really valuable tools. So when I onboarded, I mean, I don't have a team anymore. I'm independent now, right? But when I onboarded new team members, or when I join boards now, I have that conversation with my key stakeholders. Like,
it's something you often don't talk about at all.
Yeah.
You just
communication preferences.
Find out along the way. Oh, you don't like
you prefer
direct
a phone
feedback
call
immediately.
Okay, you don't want direct feedback immediately. You want it a couple of weeks later. I'm the exact opposite. I want it in the moment because then it doesn't feel emotional.
That's such a good idea, isn't it, that document?
It's brilliant. And when I first got it was like, what is this? And then I, with every passing moment, I was like, this is the smartest thing I've ever seen. How did I live without this?
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's great.
Moving on to more of a technology standpoint, and if we look at both ends of the spectrum, because the world of banking luckily has both.
Oh, yes.
The likes of COBOL and AI.
My favorite topic.
How do we manage an industry that is still dealing with both?
Oh my God. You know, I had someone call me to ask for time to show me their ChatGPT plugin for mainframe. And I was like, go away. Let's start with the obvious, right? That there are many very good reasons why we have technology from all the different eras. And one of those reasons is it still works. Like, you can say what you like, and often I do, about mainframes, but they don't fall over. That's kind of one of their superpowers. So we have technology from all the different eras because it was the best we had at the time and because it still works. But having technology from all these different eras creates immense operational complexity because you have different technology teams facing into different parts of your estate. You have risk in your system because the communication between those systems is hacked. I mean, we used to do back in the day API wrappers for mainframe-based applications. Like, so this is like the duck-billed platypus. You're not supposed to do that, right? So there's operational risk and increasing cost. And you're also managing timelines that are misaligned because you do daily releases or hourly releases with some of your technology over here, and you have a 1954 IBM mainframe over there. I actually went to dinner recently, and I had two people from one of the biggest banks. I will not name them for obvious reasons. And to my right, I had their head of distributed ledger technologies, and they had a lot of stuff live. And to my left, I had their head of mainframes. And I was stuck in the middle with you, as the song goes. The reality, the reasons why we need to face into those disparities are actually operational and risk-based rather than technological. Because the people who defend, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, are right. It ain't broke in terms of the thing it's doing. But we are increasingly looking at cost to serve, operating levers, operating risk, and we're minutes away from DORA hitting everyone. And although I don't believe anyone will be compliant with the first iteration, the reality is, forget whether you can notify the regulators within the required time frame of an outage. Would you know you've had an outage in the required time frame? So in this world, the pressure to actually harmonize your technology estate, simplify it, reduce the cost, is increasing. For me, whether you do something with AI or not is a second order question, because it depends what you're going to do with it. I think there is value in having an educated workforce and participating in the zeitgeist. All of that is important, but technology is a tool. So for me, the questions you need to answer inside your organization is what you're building resilient and scalable? I'm going to go with no. So focus on that. Is the thing you're building designed for a system-to-person real-time connectivity and data governance that will never go away? I'm going to hope the answer to that is yes these days. And the third question is what you're building evergreen-proof, in the sense that you can't become emotionally attached to any technology now. It's going to be superseded by something tomorrow. So whether you do something with ChatGPT or not, whether you do something with Copilot or not, whether you build your own LLMs, for me, that's a second order consideration. The main one is, are you simplifying your technology estate to be resilient, robust, scalable, to be data first, because that's all that matters? And are you building in such a way that you can swap out every component in the next few years? Because you're going to have to.
Without it falling to pieces.
Exactly. So whether you do those things using LLM or not, don't care.
Do you think people are just too excited by two letters that everybody's talking about?
Well, I'm sure there's an element of FOMO going on. It emerged fully formed, right? Remember that horrid couple of months where everyone was sending you poems written by ChatGPT? It's like, no, I don't want to see this. Go away. And also stop feeding your data. I think there's an element of FOMO for sure. I think there is a realization that it is a paradigm shift and we need to participate sooner than we did the last time around. But the right questions are not always being asked. We are coming at it from a place of fear, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But the regulatory context is still emerging. Explainability is still an open question. The systems are hallucinating like crazy still, and the timeframes we allow to go back and work out why and fix it are not always realistic. So I'm talking to some founders who are working in this space and who have always worked in this space, because it's new to us, but like the technology has been evolving for 50 years, right? So you talk to people who are in this space and they say you agree to do a project, and you know the hallucinations start. And it was a bit like what I was saying earlier. You get to the middle and people go, you have to accelerate now. And it's like, I can't accelerate because you have data quality issues, or we need to continue training the algorithm, or whatever it is we need to do, chances are both, to get past this step. I can't do a manual workaround here and still call it what you think it is. So there is, we're going back to the thing we were talking about at the beginning, like that the technology will go through a cycle of maturity. Most of that maturity will be acquired outside of our organizations, and that's fine. We're not inventors, right? That's fine. But we need to move at the pace of its maturity. Not faster, not slower.
It's a sensible approach.
Yeah.
I do want to go back to what you mentioned earlier, the elephant costume. What on earth was that?
That was Brian, and I have his permission to talk about him. And actually, I even do presentations occasionally, and I use his
Is
photo.
he aware you use him this much?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yeah, he is. In fact, I wrote about Brian, and I messaged him, and I was like, are you okay if I publish this? And he was like, oh my God, yeah, I'm fine with this. And I got a message from his mum on my LinkedIn with a tag to a photo of Brian getting ready for work in the morning in his elephant suit. So the story takes place in Dublin in the BNY Mellon offices. And back then, there had been a whole host of tax incentives for big American-based organizations to open subsidiaries and offices in Ireland. And there was a worry among our workforce that as the tax incentives were coming to a close, we might move the offices elsewhere. And although we people much above my pay grade had assured the teams that that wasn't happening, there was some worry, as you can imagine, right? So we were talking with a country head at the time about what we can do. To get to the real questions, whether there's something else that's really bugging people. Or if not, how we can have like a break the ice conversation. Although I was working in client-facing technology and innovation at the time, but the reality is everything comes back to people, and teams that feel uncertain don't innovate. So we ended up having to solve many problems that you wouldn't necessarily think are about your API endpoints, right? So we're sitting there and we're like, oh, we have to get to the elephant in the room. And I was like, funnily enough, I worked with a company called Student Funder, and the CEO would turn up to do his pitches in an elephant onesie because Ganesh, remover of obstacles, is also the god of education, although this guy is Mexican, so I'm not entirely sure where it all came together, but it was beautiful, it was adorable, it broke the ice. And Brian, who was then an intern, was like, I'd totally wear the onesie. And it started as a joke, but then we're like, you know what, we should do it. He bought his own onesie because he found mine was not serious enough. So I have to show you the photo now. It's like he has a full-on head and
so we're talking full elephant costume.
Yeah. Like when we finish this, I will show you. I have a photo of him on my phone. So the idea was that Brian would go to work dressed as an elephant and be the icebreaker and actually get to the heart of the topic. The reason I use this story as much as I do is because a tall, lanky elephant with a fully sized elephant head. You can't see his face, right? He's wearing the thing over. He's with the. People didn't see him in the office until he tapped them on the shoulder. He went to meetings. He sat at his desk. He took calls. I have a photo of him actually taking a call with the thing. Many people missed him until he tapped them on the shoulder, and then they jumped 3 meters in the air. You know that YouTube video?
I'm not surprised.
It's exactly. You know that YouTube video with a gorilla, right? You're asked some people playing basketball, and you're asked to count how many times the ball is passed between them, and you're counting, and then at the end it was like, how many gorillas were there? And they're like, what? And you go back, and there's a gorilla there.
Okay.
Well, someone in a gorilla suit, not a real gorilla.
Safer.
And when I had first done that, I was like, yeah, that's very funny. I had missed the gorilla, so I was very keen to find a reason why I had missed it. And I was like, that's very funny, but in real life, you wouldn't miss it. Yeah, you would. So one of the, we did the elephant experiment to find one thing, and as with most amazing experiments in life, we've discovered another. People are so immersed in their day-to-day that they don't see a grown man in an elephant suit sitting across from them or walking down the corridor to go to the loo. How can we expect them to keep an eye on the transformation of the world out there, their job that is increasingly demanding with fewer resources in here, and whatever family and personal things they've got going? And it was a very humbling moment, and Brian's a legend for doing it. But the lessons that we learned from people not seeing him were much more valuable about
Actually
what
turned into quite a good social experiment.
incredible, right? But the reality is that is the reality for everyone working inside a big organization. The day is so all-consuming, and the realities of your job, your team, your organization are so present and demanding that to ask of everyone to imagine an alternative future and how we get there, and it's unrealistic. Because people become immersed in the job they're trying to do for you, and they don't even notice what's in front of them sometimes because it's not part of the job. And it actually, it allows for a lot more empathy than we might have for the people who are just doing their job and doing the best they can. But yeah, they might miss the fact that, you know,
There's somebody dressed as a giant elephant.
yeah, or the fact that there's a new technology coming down the pipe that is very relevant to you. Or the fact that sociologically we're never going to go back to the office and therefore we need to find new ways of training our teams. We are creatures of habit, humans always are. And if you're doing a good job at the thing, you will miss a lot of the cues around you. So as a leadership team, going back to the question you asked earlier, our job is to prepare the organization for the future and balance the demands of the present. But right now, the future is being written. So the job of a leader becomes a little bit harder because you need to choose which future you're preparing your people from. But it's too much to put that on the people at the coalface.
And for those people at the coalface, what advice would you give them in today's world?
There is a place for all of us, but there is an absolute need for change in us. The jobs are changing, particularly in finance. The jobs are changing dramatically. So turning up and doing the thing we've always done is not an option anymore. Even for the more repetitive operational roles, they're changing as well. I think I would say that teachability has always been a superpower. It is now a requirement. We need to learn new things. Your organization will guide you as to the things it wants you to learn. Resistance is futile. But you can lean into your own curiosity as well, and it might take you in some interesting places in terms of where it can take you with your career. But I'm not interested in learning new things, which I've heard a lot in my career. Doesn't work anymore, sadly.
Awesome. And outside of changing the world of banking and fintech, what do you enjoy?
I'm a very naturally curious person, so I enjoy everything. Somebody sent me a book a few years back about things that are not naturally curious, and I was like, that's funny, but it's not me. And look, London is such an incredible place to be for. I spend most of my income on theatre, to be honest
Very
with
nice.
you. So I'm an avid theatre goer, and I'm in a.
What's your favourite production?
So the best post-COVID production I have seen was Jamie Lloyd's Cyrano de Bergerac with James McAvoy, and I am seeing The Tempest. Jamie Lloyd's The Tempest with Sigourney Weaver on Monday, and I have very high hopes.
Hopefully it is good.
I'm excited. I'm so excited that I need to talk myself back from being so excited because it's almost.
Otherwise, it's going to be.
Yeah, it's going to let me down because I'm expecting everything.
I thought it'd be better than that.
Yeah, exactly. You haven't changed my life, just entertained me for a couple of hours.
Awesome. Well, obviously, where can people get your book? Is it on Amazon?
It's on Amazon and it's also on the Routledge website.
And in terms of finding you elsewhere, LinkedIn, anywhere else?
I mean, I'm still on X, but
Okay.
I don't think I've been on there in a while. So LinkedIn is the best place these days.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for coming down. I appreciate everybody I speak to who knows you says how hard it is to get time with you. So
I like you. That's right. Thank you for having me.
So that means you don't like them. We'll keep that.
Yeah, sorry guys, maybe cut that bit.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.